Hello. Today I'd like to take a look at a topic, again, a favorite of mine, love, from the angle of why so many consider love so unimportant nowadays, even to the point where the very word is almost a symbol of embarrassment amongst many. At least it's certainly not regarded as a scientific word. But it's more than that. Actual source of embarrassment. And what seems to take primary importance now is acquiring money. I've seen this over and over in the last couple of years, where it's being urged to us constantly to seek to be an entrepreneur. But then, only if you give people what they want, not what you think they need, or certainly not just what's on the top of your mind. But then the underlying principle being that what people seem to want is money, not love, not anything other than what money will do for us. So there being a proliferation then of people telling us how to publish books, or how to podcast, or how to do YouTube videos. It being quite a cottage industry, in fact, to make money by telling other people how to make money doing YouTube videos. And pretty soon, 3/4 of the country will be occupied in careers telling us how to make money on YouTube videos. I'm being a little facetious here, but it seems to get to this point almost. I'm reminded, for instance, not that far back, maybe 1980s, where a man named Leo Buscaglia took the country by storm with his PBS, public broadcast system, shows on love. And, of course, many lectures, too. And he would give lectures on love, just the word love. And, in fact, I think he had a course once in college, Love 101. And one of his trademarks was that after a lecture on love, he would stay after and hug people. Sometimes the hugging would go on longer than the lecture did afterward. Everyone coming not just for the lecture on love, but to be hugged by the man who was considered the guru on love. Or consider Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst, who once wrote, amongst other books, The Art of Loving, which really was quite a bestseller as far as books are concerned, and who at one point said words to the effect that most people have never met someone capable of loving you, which I would kind of say goes part and parcel with what the Bible says, the Christian's Bible, whereas the Bible says that only God can love unconditionally, and that man's love is only a shadow of an approximation, which then I would say dovetails with what Erich Fromm said, when again he basically said that most people have never met someone capable of loving, I guess to a significant degree, or what we consider enough. And then, of course, there's the big gentleman, Mr. Freud, who I don't think spent that much time on the topic of love, but he sure did about sex. Everything to him was sex, 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 and to max out on happiness, you needed to max out on having sex. But again, that being perhaps not exactly what the word love had in mind, especially the totality of it all. So then why is love so important nowadays? If the Bible talks so much of love, and Leo Buscaglia did, and Eric Fromm, for instance. Not to mention some others, I'm sure. Well, my thoughts currently are of a couple points. First, you might say that love really takes second fiddle if you're in a state of war. I'm not just talking a battlefield where guns are drawn, but let's say an economic war. A war of getting your basic human needs met, where competition is out of this world now. Well, where does this competition that's out of this world come from then, if it's such the case? Consider the word globalization, for instance. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, after Vietnam, our war with Vietnam, whereby many countries started to compete with us. And consider the fact many of us may not know that in this country there were once perhaps 50 different television manufacturers right here in our own country, giving many people work. We could buy TVs from our own citizens' hands, so to speak, our own countries, our own companies. But now, if I'm not mistaken, there may not be a single television manufacturer located in the U.S. So how can this have happened? I suppose, in my opinion, a lot of it has to do with high housing costs compared to that in some foreign countries. Some countries, formerly Soviet countries, for instance, or Eastern Asian countries, whereby, with such extraordinarily high housing costs here, labor costs are so high, not to mention medical costs and end-of-care costs, too, in nursing homes. So then, how can we possibly compete with countries where housing costs much less? Indeed, for many years in China, it was not uncommon for someone in a family not to eat chicken more than once a year. So we're talking even dietary differences, big time, and thus costs of food. Not only then do we have differences in housing costs and transportation costs, but even food costs. So then how can we possibly compete nowadays when suddenly there's all sorts of countries offering products with far fewer pay requirements to the employees? And thus, in my mind, resulting in one concept, one word: globalization. But here's a second point I would also throw out that has also tubed the concept of love as important, the most important part of life, whereby Jesus once said in the Bible 2,000 years ago, before globalization, that love is the most important thing, basically, in that there's a verse in the Bible that says, if you are without love, you're but a clanging cymbal. So apparently back 2,000 years ago, love was quite a big deal. But again, before globalization, before it being extraordinarily hard to survive compared to the present day. Of course, back then, too, there wasn't nearly the overcrowding and scarcity of resources that there is now. And environmental problems, too. So all of this, again, making survival much more difficult than 2,000 years ago, when it was possible to say love was the most important thing. But now, again, you might say we're at a state of war for survival compared to 2,000 years ago. And then the whole definition of what's most important being survival, not love. And if you doubt that, consider those who end up in prison. Do you think love to them is the most important thing, or survival? Some of them may get their love needs met in certain ways that are unconventional, perhaps. But at any rate, I would venture to say most prisoners in a prison today, especially an overcrowded one and one with gang memberships, the most important being survival, not love. So if it's that way in prison, I would venture to say it's not that much different in America today. You might say we're all in prison of a sort, whether behind bars or not. You might also say we're at war, even though we don't have guns drawn literally. Another thing that got me thinking about all this, why love takes second or third or fourth fiddle nowadays, has to do with something I read half a year ago in a book by a philosopher named Alice Kohler. One of her books being The Stations of Solitude. And I'd like to read a few paragraphs that so illustrate to me her perspective being what I'm talking about here. That survival to her, too, was much more important than love. And she says the following, quote, being unmarried comes closely along on the heels of being unaffiliated. I've lived so long at the very edge of poverty, even for a time in its depths, that all erotic longing has vanished from me. I find myself not simply neutral, but faintly repelled at the thought of physical contact. Other urgencies appropriate my attention. Will I have money for food tomorrow? Can I keep electricity and phone connected? Pay the rent? Repair the car? Buy gas? My daily existence is far too insecure for me to have room in my thinking, my feeling, for a man, even to notice him more than fleetingly. If he stood before me. This too was new for me, integral to my individuality. Not looking for a man to rescue me. I'd have to be stably located somewhere, assured of an uninterrupted income adequate for my work, before my attention could rest on a man. but only twice in these 25 years have I been thus assured. And even though the few years that those two occasions separately encompassed seemed long to me, long enough to let me write 2 books during the first, to begin a third during the second, both had time-bound endings. Being unmarried is what most people mean when they talk of being single. Before Nantucket, I thought of it as a failure I might never surmount. Now it is the least consequential part of my life. So, indeed, when I read that, it suddenly galvanized in me that I had been right all along about some of these topics, in my own mind at least, although it's not very openly discussed or well understood by some. That how can many of us be very concerned about love or even morals when someone like even Alice Kohler is talking about how she couldn't love or even settle down to write books most of the time when she had the intellect and the insight because she was so worried about gas and insurance for her car. Not to mention in another point in her book, mentioning that one of the most important things to her was taking care of her animals. And then, of course, how do you do that without money? And finally, as a cap on all this, another short story. I used to know a man and have coffee with him every morning who was a professor of sociology. He's now at least 90 or 95 if still alive. But at any rate, he told me that way back in his life, as he was starting out, just married, that he had been teaching in a professorship position and was able, in a very short period of time, perhaps 5 years, to pay off the cost of a house for himself and his wife, while only he worked. And at that one job, I might mention, not 2 or 3. And his wife not working, perhaps, although I don't know if that's exactly correct or not. But at any rate, the point being that nowadays this would be unheard of, to pay off a house in 5 years, let alone only one spouse working or one spouse paying most of it. Of course, there being daycare issues now too, whereby many a professional ends up placing their child in daycare even after a month after birth, let's say, and then this costing an extraordinary amount of money. So these things have really shifted. In fact, today's professor may be an adjunct making almost minimum wage. Now, the other part of the equation, I believe, is not at all economic, but has to do with other forms of soothing to us, or distraction, in fact, other than love. Consider, for instance, the phrase drugs of choice. I don't know quite how popular that phrase is, but I've certainly heard it enough that everybody has their own favorite drug of choice. Or as one YouTuber I love has said, everybody has at least one addiction, in her opinion. This woman being Prepper Princess, who gives a lot of advice on YouTube about how to make it economically if you're poor. Poor at least relative to some countries. Her message being beamed out basically to Americans. But at any rate, the concept of drugs of choice being not just that there are a lot of drugs available, but they're becoming more and more destigmatized, including marijuana and CBD, a derivative, but even cocaine in the middle and upper class in particular. And two, consider the fact that the number of new drugs far outstrips any government agencies being able to even label them as a new drug, and then regulate them. This being an incredible phenomenon in the last 10 or 20 years, in fact, with designer drugs coming out at an unprecedented rate from labs all over the world, to include, of course, East Asia. And then, what about the drugs of choice offered by technology, starting with the advent of the industrialized revolution, and then proceeding on with electronics around 1900 with the invention of the radio, and then TV, and then cell phones, VCRs, DVD players, laptops, and did I mention cell phones? So, culminating then with 2-day Amazon delivery of anything, fast food restaurants like you wouldn't believe, and if I didn't mention Amazon and other online retailers, offering so many products with so much information about them beforehand and great return policies, and again 2-day delivery, that you could argue all of this is a profound number of new drugs of choice that didn't exist. And of course didn't exist in Jesus' time, when again he said that without love you're a clanging cymbal. Well, that was before the advent of the drugs of choice like the cell phone and laptop, wasn't it? And Amazon in general. So I would maintain that with all these drugs of choice out there, and getting cheaper and cheaper all the time, and with great return policies, and quality control being so good these days that you can be pretty assured that they'll be almost flawless compared to people especially. That, again, love is taking second fiddle, third fiddle, fourth fiddle. And with all of that, then, there being less and less emphasis on how to grow our talents, our abilities, our capacity to love, be empathetic, and this only compounding us to go more and more for the drug of choice solution than the people solution, the love solution, the empathy solution, the helpfulness and community solution, the religion solution. Hence, is it any wonder that I don't think there's ever been another man since Leo Buscaglia or Erich Fromm to ever utter the word love. And there being no question then, too, that I don't think there have been any more Billy Grahams or any dispute that religion is going downhill for whatever reasons. So with all of this going on, I'm not at all surprised that there's not much talk of religion or love like there used to be 30 or 40 years ago. And that, secondly, the word love is almost an embarrassment to some, and certainly considered very unscientific too. How can you even define in many people's minds what the word love even means? So, I don't have any real good answers for the whole concept in this whole life situation, because resources are getting more and more scarce. Competition is growing. Environmental degradation is becoming worse and worse. Overpopulation, in particular, is a problem. And for many years, the constant worry of possible nuclear war. Now a back burner issue in many minds, I suppose, eclipsed by many other issues. And it occurs to me too that we will never put the genie back in the Bible concerning technology and the proliferation of drugs. Not to mention the newest forms of drugs of choice being psychiatric ones with far fewer side effects than 30 or 40 years ago. Not just in how much they befuddle our minds, but in terms of potential for loss of life if overdoses are taken, such that today's psychiatric drugs are engineered to almost be suicide-proof. You can hardly find a single pill, in fact, that would do this to you, whereas Marilyn Monroe, years ago, died from a overdose of a sleeping pill, I believe. But today's sleeping pills, that's impossible to do to yourself. So again, another form of drug of choice competing with love being today's psychiatric drugs and how they've been engineered to be better and better, such that we can zone out and care less if anyone loves us, let alone where we may live and under what conditions. And technology isn't going away either. That can't be stuffed in the genie's bottle back in either. So I don't have any answers here, any real good answers. But of course, just bringing up these questions and getting clarity, I think, is good. Who knows where it might lead? A dialogue based on greater clarity, greater information, greater understanding. And that's what I throw out to the audience listening. Are some thoughts I've had in the past few years as I have had the opportunity to look into, as some haven't, and to ponder. So I leave everybody with these thoughts. Not that I have the answer, quite complex, and maybe there is no answer. Maybe the Titanic has been struck and is going down. But a dialogue, a looking into, again, a search for greater clarity and more information, I think is a very good step to take and gives some hope where in many cases we feel hopeless. I wish you a good day.